Hey guys, today we're diving in with the Industrial Revolution. We'll be focusing quite a bit on Europe, but also on Asia, a little bit of Africa, and the Americas. The agricultural revolution began a long time before the 18th century. Our years for focusing on industrial revolution are 1750 to 1850. But before we can talk about that, we have to really get into what actually causes it. And new food crops, many of which were from the Americas, thank you Columbian Exchange, as well as new forage crops produced more food per acre and allowed farmers to raise more cattle for meat and milk. Only very wealthy landowners could afford to invest in new crops as well as new farming methods. So these rich landowners fenced off their own land and common land to apply new scientific farming methods. And this is called enclosing or the enclosure movement. And as they're doing this, they're forcing their former tenants who would lease small areas of land to become what's called a sharecropper or just landless laborer. And if they couldn't or wouldn't do that, the only other option was to migrate to cities to look for factory work. And as you can see, we have the enclosed lands right here. And this is actually a map that would detail who owned what land. And one of these new methods of farming is field one would be wheat, field two barley, and then field three was left to fallow so the soil could replenish. And this is also where animals would graze. And not to gross you guys out, but as animals graze, as they eat, they also poo. And the poo was very good for the soil. A long period of commercial expansion, which was driven by the success of colonial empires and by rapid population growth at home, preceded the Industrial Revolution. In most of Europe, increasing demand for goods was met with increasing production in traditional ways, through the addition of new craftspeople to existing workshops and through the putting out system. And that's right here. I'll talk about that in just a minute. The rise on demand also prompted the development of infrastructure like roads and ports to facilitate increasing levels of trade. Population growth and increased agricultural productivity were accompanied by a growth in trade and a fascination with technology and innovation, aka, how can we do this for cheap? So, what we have here is the cottage system where people trained in a certain area, such as weaving, would come together and produce goods. But here we have the putting out system where you have different locations, the spinners moving on to the weavers, finished cloth takes it to town. So you have multiple people doing one thing and passing it along. The population growth. So here's the thing, guys. There are a number of consequences, both local and global, from the Industrial Revolution. In the 18th century, more reliable food supplies, earlier marriages and high birth rates, and more widespread resistance to disease contributed to the significant population growth in Europe. England and Wales experienced particularly rapid population growth. It also meant that children accounted for a relatively high proportion of the total population. And the growth in the number of people also contributed to migration of people from the countryside to cities, from Ireland to England, and from Europe to the Americas. So as you can see, you've got after the Industrial Revolution, this is what it looks like. And here you have just the sheer number of cities, highly populated areas, and this is what it looked like before. So you can see more spread out here, much more concentrated. So Britain and continental Europe. 18th century Britain had a number of characteristics that helped to explain its peculiar role in the Industrial Revolution. These characteristics include economic growth, population growth, people who were willing to put new ideas into practice, strong mining and metal industries, the world's largest merchant marine, and a relatively fluid social structure. England had a large and ready source of raw materials from its empire. They also had a great water transportation system, a unified market, and a highly developed commercial sector. The economies of continental Europe experienced a similar dynamic expansion in the 18th century, but lack of markets and management skills and the constant warfare from 1789 to 1815 interrupted trade and weakened the incentive to invest in new technologies. Industrialization took hold in Europe after 1815, first in Belgium and then in Germany and France. European governments played a significant role in fostering industrialization, and a great example would be the government in Germany. Towards the end of the 1800s, Germany will have more railroads per square mile than any other European country. So what I want you to take a look at, green, you have exposed coal fields. Red outline the industrial sectors. Purple, centers of woolen cloth production. And then the black lines are railroads. And this is just in Great Britain. So take a look. Very impressive. And moving on, mass production. Pottery was imported or handmade for the aristocracy. And in either event, ordinary people could not afford it. So we've seen the beautiful china that is coming from Asia, wonderfully painted porcelain, cups, vases. Prior to this, people would use pewter cups. The growing taste for tea, cocoa, and coffee created a demand for porcelain because porcelain doesn't spoil the flavor of these beverages. There's a reason that you don't use certain cups for hot beverages. There's a reason that when you're drinking coffee or tea, you normally have it in a porcelain or a glass mug. And that's because when it's in metal, particularly pewter or awfully enough lead, the taste of the metal can actually be leached out because of how hot the beverage is. And again, the coffee trade, coffee is not that expensive. Cup of coffee, 1 penny, penny universities, guys. Remember that very nice DBQ we did? Because the growing taste for these hot beverages, you have the growing demand for porcelain. The problem is most people can't afford it. So this is where you have Josiah Wedgwood. He opened a pottery business that used the division of labor, so sort of taking the putting out system, taking that out of a town and putting it in one convenient location. And rather than using a potter's wheel, he had the idea of creating molds that porcelain could be poured into, if you will, and then fired. And this was a mass production of a high quality porcelain at a very low cost that made it affordable to everybody. And generally, this is how porcelain things are made today. This is why coffee cups can be mass produced. This is why when I go to Pier 1 to stock up or Home Goods to stock up on coffee mugs, I can leave with 8 different styles of coffee mugs. Not that I've done that. Just saying I could if I wanted to. Anyway, moving on. Cotton industry. There's a strong market for cotton cloth. A couple of reasons why. 1, it's not itchy. 2, durable. 3, cheap. 4, you can do a lot of different things with it. You can dye it. You can use it for different types of textiles, clothes, blankets, rags, yada, yada, yada. But the problem is, cotton plant does not grow in Europe. Restrictions on the import of cotton cloth led to inventors and entrepreneurs devising cheap mechanical methods for spinning cotton thread and weaving cotton cloth in England. And beginning in the 1760s, a series of inventions revolutionized the spinning of cotton thread. These included the spinning jenny, the water frame, and the mule. And that's what I have over here for you. I don't know how any of that works. That would be a good question for a reenactment town. Someone who reads about this, somebody who actually knows how to use this. Look it up. The increased supply of cotton thread and the demand for cotton cloth led to the invention of power looms and other machinery and processes for cotton textile production. Mechanization of cotton textile production led to greater efficiency and lower prices, but here's the thing, guys, it's not nearly as beautiful, it's not nearly as well spun as the cotton from India. But we'll get into that in just a little bit. Cotton would become America's most valuable crop. It was produced for export to England, and from the 1820s for America's own cotton textile industry. And textiles proved to be the most successful of the early industrialized products. This really isn't a surprise because the Medici family of Florence were cotton merchants. They ran Florence, and they pretty much single-handedly financed the Renaissance, or at least the most famous parts of the Renaissance. So people already knew, hey, cloth is the way to go. And Britain switched to importing raw cotton. And one of the reasons why Britain takes over India is so they can get the cotton, and also so they can drive India's cotton industry into the ground. Increases in textile production led to a need for more raw cotton, and by the mid-19th century, nearly all types of production, cotton or others, were transformed by steamed engines and divisions of labor. And we will talk about different groups that pop up in Defiance, but one of the most famous are the Luddites, and they're a group of English artisans who saw industrialization as a threat to their income and lifestyle, and they are correct. But like I said, we'll get into them in just a little bit. The iron industry. Iron had been in Eurasia and Africa for thousands of years, but iron production was associated with deforestation, that increased the price of charcoal and thus reduced the output of iron. Limited wood supplies and the high cost of skilled labor made iron a rare and valuable metal outside of China before the 18th century. In the 18th century, a series of inventions, including coke and puddling, made it possible for the British to produce large amounts of cheap iron. Increased production and lower cost led people to use iron for numerous applications, including bridge building and the construction of the Crystal Palace. The idea of interchangeable parts originated in the 18th century, but it was widely adopted for the firearms, farm equipment, and sewing machine industries in the 19th century. The use of machinery to mass produce consumer goods with identical parts was known as the American system of manufacturers. So, what I have for you, you've got the puddling to make wrought iron, and you can review how that's done. You also have Eli Whitney's idea of interchangeable parts. The guy built 10 guns, disassembled them before the US Congress, and then built them and put them back together. And this is how he got financing, because before everything was made by hand, parts were made by machines. And these machines, when they were broken, required a skilled technician, but now the parts were interchangeable and they could be replaced by anybody. Obviously, it's a problem because it does drive the skilled repair people out of business. Eiffel Tower, wrought iron, very nice, very nice. That's how it's built. Moving along, the steam engine. The most revolutionary invention of the 18th century. If anybody asks you, what was the most revolutionary invention of the Industrial Revolution, you say the steam engine. Between 1702 and 1712, Thomas Newcomen developed a crude, inefficient steam engine that was used to pump water out of coal mines, but in 1769, James Watt improved that engine and began to manufacture engines for sale to actual manufacturers and factories. Watt's engine provided a source of power that allowed factories to be located where animal, wind, and water power was lacking. In the 1780s, the steam engine was used to power riverboats in France and America. And in the 1830s, the development of the more efficient engines made it possible to build ocean-going steamships. Obviously, this picture is incredibly photoshopped. Not the point, it just shows you what you can do with the steam engine, riverboat, ocean liner, as well as trains. And that leads us to railroads. After 1800, inventors, including George Stephenson and Richard Trevithick, built lighter, more powerful high-pressure steam engines and used them to power steam locomotives that soon replaced the horses on horsepower railways. Railway building mania swept Britain from 1825 to 1845 as the major cities and then small towns were linked by a network of railroads. In the US, railway booms in the 1840s and 50s linked the country together and opened the Midwest to agricultural development, obviously displacing the people who already lived there. In Europe, railways accelerated industrialization by stimulating the iron, machinery, and construction industries. Most 19th century states did not industrialize, but were connected to those that did via transportation and communication. And one thing we do also, of course, need to mention, the building of the railroads in Europe also increases the number of people who immigrate to the Americas, specifically people from China and from Ireland to help build these railroads. And you shouldn't even say to help build them, they built them. Most 19th century states if they did not industrialize, they were connected to those that did. And one of Britain's advantages at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution was its transportation network. Railroads proved to be an efficient and cheap way of moving people and goods. In addition to the railroads, steamships moved goods and people cheaply, and industrialization, of course, leads to faster communication. So here you have the various rail systems in Europe, and this is still one of the most efficient ways to move around. So given our location, very, very easy to get to the city just by jumping on the train. Most of the larger cities in America have some kind of transportation system. What's interesting, though, is in Europe, this is how a lot of people, like a very large chunk of the population, actually go from place to place. Very, very effective railway system, be they subways, above ground trains. You can pretty much get anywhere you need on the train, which is something that you only find in the major cities here. Just a little side note, when I was an exchange student in Stockholm, Sweden, all of the exchange students had an opportunity to explore Lapland, which is basically going so north you're in the Arctic Circle. And we got to stay in this town called Abisko. And I went in 2008. In 2005, there were 85 people living in this town. And in the winter, it was pretty much pitch black for the majority of the day because it was so far north. But I just remember going there by train, and the people were so friendly, but they were very, very cut off from people outside of the town. There was a train that did come in. This was a town that all the supplies had to be brought in by train because it was just so far away from anything. All right, so moving on. Speaking of communication, which industrialization leads to better communication, you have the introduction of the telegraph. Two systems of telegraphy were invented in 1837. The Wheatstone and Cook's five-needle method telegraph in England and Morse's dots and dashes in the US. In the 1840s and 50s, Americans and Europeans had begun building what would become a global communications network, which will lead to even more impacts in the early industrial revolution, which we'll pick up next time. So if you have any questions, shoot me an email. Otherwise, have a great night, guys. Cheers.